Welcome back to the Urban Herald and our ongoing series, When the World Broke.
That's right. This is episode 3, and today we're diving into, well, just an immense catastrophe.
We are. Following our episodes on the Lisbon earthquake and the Tambora eruption, today we're tackling the 1931 China floods. We've gathered the sources, the research.
And it paints a picture of an event that's often called the single deadliest natural disaster of the entire 20th century.
It's a stark title. And the sources really emphasize this wasn't just about bad weather, was it?
No, not at all. It was this terrifying convergence. Meteorological chaos, yes, but also deep political dysfunction, crumbling infrastructure, and then, crucially, a massive public health collapse afterwards.
The scale itself is just hard to grasp. The death toll figures alone are debated, aren't they?
Hugely debated. Academic estimates, they range widely. Some conservative figures put it around 422,000.
Which is already enormous.
Enormous. But other credible studies push that number up towards, well, a staggering 4 million lives lost. When you factor in everything, the drowning, the disease, the starvation that followed.
4 million. It forces you to look beyond just the floodwaters.
Exactly. And that's really the core takeaway from the sources, our thesis for this deep dive. The drowning, horrific as it was almost the opening act. The main event, the thing that dragged on and really multiplied the death toll, was disease and starvation. Systemic failure, essentially.
Okay, let's unpack this. We hear a lot about climate disasters today, but what exactly went into this perfect storm back in 1931? And why is it so important for us, listening now?
Well, the lessons are incredibly relevant, depressingly so sometimes. Modern context shows intense flooding is still a massive issue in China. Just look at the first half of 2025, something like $7.6 billion in economic losses from floods.
Wow.
And climate science is backing this up. There's compelling data showing rainfall intensity across Asia has increased by about 22% over the last 50 years.
22%.
Yeah. So those kinds of compound extreme weather events that triggered 1931, they're becoming more likely, more frequent. Understanding how things collapsed back then, the specific failure points, it's critical if we want to avoid that scale of loss again.
Right. Let's start with the weather then, because it wasn't just a summer storm. The sources say the roots of this go back further.
They really do. You have to look at the winter of 1930-1931. The records point to an exceptionally harsh winter, just unprecedented amounts of snow and ice piling up in the mountains, the headwaters of the Yangtze Basin.
So like a massive frozen reservoir just waiting up there.
Precisely. Think about that huge snowpack. Spring arrives, the thaw begins, and you get this enormous meltwater surge heading downstream.
Okay, normal spring floods may be bigger.
Well, that's the thing. It wasn't normal, because at the same time, the Yangtze Basin got hit by what meteorologists at the time called one continuous deluge. Heavy spring rains just kept coming. So the massive snowmelt merged with these heavy spring rains before the usual summer flood season even kicked off. By early June, the rivers were already alarmingly high. River gauges showed levels you'd normally only see at the peak of summer.
The system was already stressed before the main event.
Exactly. Primed for disaster. And then came July. This is where it just goes off the charts.
This is the really wild part in the sources. Not 1 or 2 storms.
9. 9 cyclonic storms hit the region in July 1931 alone.
9. When the average is usually...
Maybe 2 a year for that area. So 9 in 1 month. It's statistically almost unbelievable.
What was driving that? Just freak weather.
It seems like a combination of factors. Intense tropical cyclones tracking unusually far inland, probably strong El Niño patterns messing with atmospheric conditions, maybe unusual high-pressure systems over the Pacific, just funneling moisture right into central China.
And the ground was already soaked.
Completely saturated from the spring. So every drop from these cyclones just ran straight off into the rivers. There was nowhere for it to go.
The data on rainfall is just staggering. You mentioned 4 weather stations.
Yeah, along the Yangtze, they recorded over 600 millimeters of rain just in July.
600 millimeters in a month. How does that compare to normal?
Okay, get this. That's about 1.5 times the entire annual rainfall for that area falling in a single month.
1.5 times the whole year's rain in 1 month.
It just completely overwhelmed everything. Any flood defenses, drainage systems, pointless against that volume.
And it didn't stop in July, did it?
Ooh, that's the other crucial factor, the persistence. It rained relentlessly through August into September. The land, the lakes, the rivers, they had zero chance to drain or recover.
Like a siege.
A siege by water, exactly.
Mm.
Look at Hangzhou, a major city in Wuhan. Between June and August, it got around 1,800 millimeters of rain.
Compared to its usual annual total of...
About 1,100 millimeters, so again, way over a year's worth of rain in just 3 months. The land just broke.
So nature throws this absolutely unprecedented series of punches. But the geography of the area itself played a huge role in how bad it got.
Oh, absolutely. The sheer scale of the flooding is hard to picture. The sources talk about 180,000 square kilometers inundated.
180,000 square kilometers. How big is that, really?
Think of England, and then add about half of Scotland, all of that underwater. Central China basically became this vast inland sea, 8 provinces affected.
This mind-boggling scale, not just rivers over banks, but a whole landscape submerged.
And that type of landscape was key, especially the middle reaches of the Yangtze. It flows through these incredibly flat plains, great for farming usually, but terrible for drainage.
So when the banks broke,
The water just spread out horizontally, miles and miles across farmland, villages, cities. Nothing to stop it. At its peak in Hangzhou, the water was 16 meters. That's over 50 feet above its normal level. Photos from the time to show rooftops sticking out of the water.
and this wasn't empty land. You mentioned the human toll earlier.
Right. About 51 million people directly affected by the flooding. And these were some of the most densely populated agricultural regions on Earth. People lived by the river, relied on its fertility.
Which made them incredibly vulnerable when it turned.
Hugely vulnerable. And then there was another complicating factor, something the sources highlight. The Huai River.
Okay, what was the issue with the Y?
It was kind of a man-made problem, brewing for decades. See, the Yellow River had changed its course way back in 1855.
Right.
And when it did that, it basically blocked the Huai River's natural path to the sea.
So the Y, this other major river collecting rainfall, didn't have a proper outlet.
Exactly. It ended up draining into the series of large lakes, which then had to overflow into the Yangtze system.
Which was already completely overloaded in 1931.
Precisely. So you had extreme rainfall hitting both the Yangtze and Huai basins at the same time. The Huai water backed up, the lakes overflowed, adding even more water into the choked Yangtze. It was hydrological chaos across this enormous area. The water was trapped. A failure to adapt to that earlier environmental change just massively compounded the 1931 crisis.
Okay, so we have this unprecedented weather hitting a vulnerable landscape. But the sources keep coming back to the human element. How an extreme event became the deadliest disaster of the century. You mentioned a hydraulic crisis?
Yes, that's a term historians use. It had been building for, over a century before 1931. China had these incredibly sophisticated dike and canal systems built over centuries. Some were really advanced for their time.
But by 1931,
They were crumbling, catastrophically neglected. The root cause goes back to the late Qing dynasty, really. Decades of mismanagement.
why? What happened to the upkeep? Where did the money go?
The sources are pretty clear on this. From about 1800 right up to 1928, the funds meant for maintaining these vital dikes were just systematically diverted.
Diverted where?
Military spending, mostly, supporting various wars, internal conflicts, and outright embezzlement by corrupt officials, especially during that unstable period when the Qing dynasty fell and the Republic was trying to establish itself.
So the flood defenses were starved of cash for generations.
That's the grim reality. Engineers who assessed the damage after the 1931 floods found dikes riddled with erosion, structural weaknesses, places where the foundations were undermined. Some sections were even weakened because locals had dug out earth and materials from the dikes themselves to build houses or whatever.
Wow.
So the system, originally built for protection, actually became a massive liability. When the extreme water hit in 31, the dikes weren't just ineffective, they actively failed, catastrophically.
And layered on top of this failing infrastructure was the political situation. China in 1931 was fractured, to put it mildly.
Extremely fractured. You had the nationalist government, relatively new, trying to assert control, but they were fighting communist insurgencies. And large parts of the country were still effectively ruled by regional warlords. It was chaos.
What did that political chaos mean when the floods hit on the ground?
It meant there was no effective national response. No central coordination, no system for moving resources from safe areas to flooded ones, no plan for mass evacuation, no reliable communication across provinces.
So each province, each city, was basically on its own.
Pretty much. trying to handle this continent-spanning disaster with whatever local resources they had, which were often fragmented and totally inadequate.
And we see the deadly result of all this in the Gaoyu Lake disaster. That part of this story is just horrific.
It really is. This wasn't slow flooding. It was sudden, violent failure. The dikes near Gaoyu Lake breached around 2:08 a.m. on August 25th, middle of the night, most people asleep.
Completely unprepared.
Totally. Survivors talked about hearing this immense roar, the sound of these old, neglected dikes just giving way, and then they described a sudden great wall of water sweeping through.
Instantly catastrophic.
In Gaoyu County alone, the estimates are 18,000 people drowned almost instantly, swept away in the dark.
18,000. Just like that. But the Gaoyu story doesn't end there, does it? Gives us a really crucial insight into the whole disaster.
It absolutely does, because researchers tracked the population after the initial flood, and what they found was shocking. In the year following the flood, another 58,000 residents of Gaoyu died. From famine, from disease.
58,000 more. After the water had gone down.
Exactly, which gives you this devastating ratio. For every one person who drowned initially, 3 more died later from the consequences. The indirect deaths.
A 3-to-1 ratio, indirect deaths to direct deaths.
Yes, and that pattern, that 3.1 ratio, was tragically mirrored across the entire flood zone. It fundamentally changes how we have to understand this disaster.
Why is that ratio so important looking back now? Why does it matter for, say, modern disaster planning?
It matters hugely because it tells you where the greatest loss of life actually occurs. It's not usually in the immediate impact of the hazard itself, the earthquake, the floodwaters. It's in the prolonged crisis afterwards.
The breakdown of society, basically.
Right. The breakdown of health systems, food supplies, shelter, sanitation. So when international aid agencies today plan their response, that 3-to-1 ratio is a constant reminder. Investing in shelter, food, and especially sanitation and clean water immediately saves far more lives in the long run than just focusing on search and rescue. It's the long tail of the disaster that's often the deadliest.
And looking at the engineering failure at Gaoyu, it wasn't just neglect, was it? There was a flaw in the whole approach to flood control back then.
Yeah, the sources point to this philosophy of absolute containment. The idea was just build the walls high enough, strong enough to hold everything back. Pure defense.
By trying to bottle up a tsunami.
Kind of, yeah. It completely ignored the need for safety valves, basically. What modern engineers call floodways or relief channels, areas designed to let water overflow in a controlled way during extreme events to relieve pressure on the main system.
So they didn't have those.
No. The system was rigid. It held the pressure, held it, until the weakest point just exploded. And then you got these cascading failures where one breach led to another, and the disaster just ripped across the landscape with terrifying speed. It was a fundamentally flawed approach.
We often picture floods devastating rural areas, farmland.
Yeah.
But these floods hit major cities hard too, didn't they? Turned them into something else entirely.
Oh, absolutely. Major industrial and population centers were besieged. Take Wuhan, a huge metropolis even then. Its dikes were breached on July 27.
And the city stayed flooded.
For nearly 3 months. Underwater. Imagine that. Trapping almost 800,000 city residents, plus countless thousands of refugees who'd fled there from the countryside thinking it was safer.
3 months underwater. How did people even survive? Where did they live?
Anywhere high up. Upper floors of buildings became islands, railway stations, public squares on slightly higher ground. People crammed into these improvised shelters.
Which must have created horrific conditions.
Desperate conditions, unbelievably overcrowded, critically unsanitary. People living shoulder to shoulder for weeks, months, often without clean water, without proper waste disposal. It was a recipe for disease.
And Nanjing, which was the capital of China at the time, was also hit hard. That must have been a huge blow to the government.
A massive blow and deeply embarrassing for the nationalist government. One observer described Nanjing during the flood as having this noxious cocktail running through the streets. Flood water mixed with sewage, animal carcasses floating around, industrial chemicals, just toxic soup. It paralyzed the government, crippled communications, hampered relief efforts, and it really damaged the regime's credibility, both domestically and internationally. You can't effectively govern from underwater.
So the water is everywhere. It's toxic. People are crammed together. We know the death toll was enormous, but you said drowning wasn't the main killer? How do we know that for sure?
The key evidence comes from a really important piece of research done at the time. A field survey led by an American agricultural economist named John Lossing Buck. He was at the University of Nanking.
Okay.
His team went out into the affected areas, collected data meticulously, real on the ground, empirical evidence, cutting through the rumors and the chaos.
And what did Buck's survey find about how people were dying?
This is the crucial finding. His team determined that drowning accounted for less than a quarter, maybe 25% of all the deaths during the first 100 days or so.
Less than a quarter.
Right. Now, that initial drowning toll was still horrific, probably around 150,000 people, a huge tragedy in itself.
But it means?
It means that 3/4 of the deaths, even early on, and the vast majority of the millions who died later, were due to other causes: disease, starvation, systemic collapse.
That pattern, Buck identified indirect deaths vastly outweighing direct deaths that's still relevant.
Absolutely. It's a grim reality we still see in major humanitarian crises today. The immediate hazard is terrible, but the long-term failure of basic systems is what kills the most people.
So let's talk about the real killers then, the diseases that rip through those camps.
Right, with contaminated water everywhere and sanitation systems totally gone, it was a perfect storm for epidemics. Cholera was devastating.
How does cholera spread so fast?
Through contaminated water and food, human waste. And it acts incredibly quickly. People, often already weak from malnutrition and stress, could become severely dehydrated and die within hours if not treated.
The official records mention a cholera epidemic the next year, 1932, killing around 32,000. But do you think the real number was higher?
Almost certainly several times higher. Record keeping had completely broken down in many areas. Cholera was just one nightmare. Typhus was another huge killer.
Typhus, how does that spread?
Body lice, which thrive in exactly those kinds of crowded, unsanitary conditions where people can't wash themselves or their clothes for weeks on end. And typhus is deadly. Mortality rates can be as high as 40% if it's untreated. It just swept through families trapped in their shelters.
And there were others too, right? Like dysentery.
Yes, dysentery was rampant. Bacterial infections causing severe diarrhea, especially deadly for young children who dehydrate very quickly. It wasn't just sickness, it was, as the sources suggest, a systematic decimation driven by a total sanitation catastrophe.
Can you give us a sense of just how bad that sanitation failure was?
Well, imagine traditional waste management systems, often basic to begin with, completely obliterated by the floodwaters. The refugee camps were set up in haste on hills and buildings. They often lacked even basic latrines, especially at first.
So waste just accumulated.
Accumulated where people were living, eating, sleeping. It leached directly into the floodwaters, into the groundwater, which was often the only water source people had, however contaminated.
It's hard to even imagine.
The sources document some camps where the mortality rate hit 50% on an annualized basis. 50%. People were dying at an unbelievable rate simply because the environment itself had become toxic. The very water needed for life was turned into a poison. That's why you have to see 1931 fundamentally as a public health disaster triggered by a flood.
You'd think a disaster of this magnitude, killing millions, would force immediate radical change in how China managed its rivers. But the sources suggest the learning curve was actually surprisingly slow and difficult.
It was painfully slow. The immediate aftermath really highlights the political weakness we talked about. They set up a National Flood Relief Commission, but it faced an impossible task financially.
They needed huge amounts of money.
Hundreds of millions of dollars, which was an astronomical sum in the 1930s, especially for that government. Money needed to properly redesign the whole system based on, modern hydraulic engineering principles that were emerging.
But they didn't have the money or maybe the political will, so what did they do instead?
They took the shortcut, the dangerous shortcut. They essentially decided just to repair the dikes to the status quo ante.
Status quo ante, meaning?
Meaning back to how they were before they failed. They just patched the holes, maybe raised the walls a little bit. They didn't do the fundamental redesign like building proper floodways or significant upstream dams for storage that was obviously needed.
Why? Was it purely about cost, or was there resistance to new ideas?
It seems like a mix, according to the sources. Cost was definitely the biggest factor. The nationalist government was fighting wars, didn't control the whole country, couldn't possibly fund a project on that scale. But there was probably also some bureaucratic inertia, a tendency to stick with familiar methods, even though they'd just failed spectacularly. The focus was on patching things up quickly, not on long-term resilience.
And the price of that short-sightedness was paid pretty quickly, wasn't it?
Tragically, yes. Just 4 years later, in 1935, the Yangtze flooded badly again. Another 145,000 people died. It proved those simple repairs were nowhere near enough.
So the real learning took decades. How can we see that progress?
You can track it by looking at later floods. Take 1954. There was another massive flood on the Yangtze, physically comparable in scale to 1931.
Okay. But the death toll?
Significantly lower. Estimates range from about 33,000 up to maybe 149,000. Still terrible, but drastically less than the potential millions of 1931.
What made the difference in 54? Was it massive new dams already?
Not primarily, no. The big engineering projects came later. The difference in 54 was more about systemic improvements under the new communist government, better communication networks, allowing for earlier warnings, centralized command for coordinating responses, and critically organized mass evacuation procedures.
So better organization and social systems save lives, even before the ultimate engineering fixes.
Exactly. It showed that state capacity and planning mattered hugely.
But the real game changer, in terms of both engineering and drastically lower death tolls, came much later. The 1998 floods seemed to be the turning point in the sources.
1998 is the starkest comparison. That flood was actually bigger physically than 1931 in some ways, affected 240 million people across 29 provinces. Huge event.
But the number of deaths?
Only around 3,650.
3,500 compared to potentially millions.
Right. It was dramatic proof that decades of modernization had finally paid off. By 1998, China had built extensive upstream dams and reservoirs. They had modern dike systems designed to international standards. They had satellite weather monitoring for early warning. And they had well-drilled, coordinated response plans. The death rate was orders of magnitude lower than 1931.
And the ultimate expression of that long-term flood control vision is the Three Gorges Dam.
Yes, the Three Gorges, completed around 2012, was explicitly conceived and justified as the way to prevent another 1931-level catastrophe on the Yangtze. It's an immense structure.
How does it work for flood control?
It has a massive amount of storage capacity, 22.1 billion cubic meters, specifically reserved just for holding back floodwaters. Since it started operating, it's intercepted major flood peaks about 70 times, diverted huge amounts of water, over 220 billion cubic meters, that would otherwise have surged downstream towards vulnerable cities.
There was a recent example, wasn't there, in 2020?
Yeah, 2020 saw severe flooding. The dam was crucial. It cut the peak flow coming downstream from a potentially catastrophic 70,000 cubic meters per second down to about 40,000. Models suggest that likely saved cities like Wuhan from devastating inundation.
So it's success in terms of flood control?
Largely, yes, for the areas downstream. But the Three Gorges is also incredibly controversial. It embodies this deep tension.
How so? What are the downsides?
Well, critics point to new risks. Increased danger of landslides along the huge reservoir slopes, and the nightmare scenario, however unlikely, of a catastrophic dam failure, which would be unimaginably devastating for tens of millions downstream.
And the human cost of building it was immense, too.
Absolutely undeniable. Somewhere between 1.1 and 1.4 million people were displaced to make way for the reservoir. Uprooted from their homes, their communities, many lost farmland, cultural heritage sites were submerged. The resettlement process caused enormous social and economic disruption.
That's a staggering number of people moved. What about the environmental impacts?
Also significant and still debated. The big one is sediment. The Yangtze naturally carries vast amounts of silt downstream, which builds up the riverbanks and the delta. The dam traps most of that sediment, maybe up to 90% of it.
What does that do?
It causes erosion downstream. As the clear water picks up more sediment from the riverbed and banks, it destabilizes the coastline. And ecologically, it's been disastrous for some species. It contributed heavily to the extinction of the Yangtze River dolphin, for instance, by changing its habitat and food sources.
And there's one more tension you mentioned, inherent in how the dam itself is operated.
Yes, this is a constant dilemma. For flood control, you want to keep the reservoir level low during the flood season so you have space to absorb incoming floodwaters.
Right, makes sense.
But the dam's other main job is generating hydroelectric power. And for maximum power generation, you want the reservoir level as high as possible.
So there's a conflict.
A direct conflict in operational priorities, especially right before and during the flood season. It forces difficult real-time decisions. And critics worry that the pressure to maximize power revenue might sometimes compromise the flood safety margin. It echoes, in a modern way, those past failures where short-term needs compromised long-term safety.
Ultimately, though, the sources seem clear that the memory, the ghost of 1931, really does drive planning now. It forces them to think about the future climate.
Without a doubt, modern infrastructure design in China, especially along the Yangtze, isn't just based on historical flood records anymore. It has to factor in climate change, the reality of more frequent, more intense rainfall becoming the new normal. The scale of 1931 ensures you can't afford to ignore that possibility. Hashtag tag outro.
So pulling it all together from the sources, the core lesson from 1931 seems crystal clear. Natural hazards are one thing, but they only become these truly epic catastrophes when they hit human vulnerabilities head on.
Exactly. Aging infrastructure nobody maintained, political chaos preventing a coordinated response, and maybe most critically, the almost total failure of public health systems in the aftermath.
It makes that point about sanitation just resonate so strongly. We focus on the dramatic rescue, the immediate impact.
Right, but the data screams that planning for basic needs shelter, yes, but absolutely critical sanitation and clean water from day one in any displacement camp, that's what saves the most lives.
That 3-to-1 ratio again. Preventing disease in the camps is 3 times more effective than just treating it later.
It's a fundamental truth learned the hardest way possible. Modern disaster protocols worldwide now put volage water, sanitation, and hygiene right at the forefront for that very reason. Planning shelter is planning sanitation.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty pointed question, doesn't it? We live in an age where climate risks are intensifying everywhere.
Mm-hmm. And despite all the incredible technology, the satellites, the forecasting models, the massive dams like Three Gorges, those fundamental tensions we talked about are still there.
That pressure between development building more, expanding cities, and managing the inherent flood risk.
Exactly. Are we really making the hard choices to maybe not build in certain areas, even if it means less immediate economic gain? And crucially, are we investing enough in the boring stuff? The sustained maintenance of the infrastructure we already have, the social systems, the public health preparedness during the normal times.
Because those systems are what need to function when the abnormal hits.
Precisely. That comparison between 1931 and 1998 is powerful proof. Same river, similar or even bigger floods physically in 98, but thousands dead instead of millions. Catastrophe isn't inevitable.
But preventing it took decades of focused effort, massive investment, political will.
It did. So the provocative thought for all of us today is, are our societies, wherever we live, making those sustained investments now? Are we building the resilience, not just in concrete, but in our social fabric, to ensure that the next extreme event doesn't trigger the kind of systemic collapse that made 1931 the horror it was? Are we learning the lesson?